To set up the game, you're going to need to assemble the puzzle piece-sized board together to form a single board. Make sure when you do this that the gears of the board all connect to each other so that this one solo gear is able to spin all of them at the same time. Make sure one of these blue markers is lined up with this arrow on the side of the board. Next, place a certain amount of these corn tiles on the fields of the board depending on how many players are in the game. If you are playing with 4 players, you'll fill all of them in. If you are playing with 3 players, one of each of these fields would be empty. If you are playing with 2 players, then 2 of these slots would be empty. Since I'm setting up for a 4-player game, however, I will leave all of them on. Next, you will take these wood tokens and place them over each of the remaining 3 fields according to the number of players. Once the setup for this green wheel is done, you should have 1 field full of corn depending on the number of players. Like I said, if you're playing with 2, you leave 2 empty, and if you're playing with 3, you leave 1 empty. But you will have a field of just corn, and then you will have 3 rows of corn covered by these wooden tokens. Next, shuffle this stack of H1 building tiles and then flip enough of them over so that the buildings will cover the entire row. The remaining H1 building tiles and the H2 building tiles can then be set aside for now. They'll come into play later on. Shuffle this stack of monument tiles and place a certain amount of them out onto this row depending on the number of players in the game. Since I'll be setting up for a 4-player game, I'll be filling in the entire row. If you are playing with 3 players, you'll leave 1 of these out, and if you are playing with 2 players, you'll leave 2 of these out. The remaining monuments can be put back in the box as they will not be used. There are 4 types of buildings and 3 types of monuments, and they're each separated by a specific color: farms, civic buildings, shrines, and tombs. However, the only things you really need to know about them are 2 things. One is that each of them has a cost represented by resources in the top of the building, and each of them has an effect that happens when you build them. One thing that's different between these, however, is that the monuments will only have their effect triggered at the end of the game. The buildings, however, have their effects trigger immediately when you build them. Place all of the corn tokens, the resource tokens, and the crystal skulls nearby as they'll be used later. Give each player a player sheet and make sure when they get their player sheet they place it with this side face up, not this side. Then make sure each of them get 3 workers. The remaining 3 workers can be set aside for now as they will have a chance to get them later on in the game. Take all of these small discs that each of the players have and have each of them place 1 disc on the 0 space of each of the different gods, as well as 1 on each of the starting spaces of the technology tracks. Place each player's large disc, which is their scoring marker, and place it on the 0 space of the scoring track. Finally, take this stack of starting tiles and deal 4 tiles out to each player. Each of these starting tiles has a certain amount of corn, resources, gods, and technology trees, along with symbols like these 3, with a crystal skull, gaining an extra worker, or having one of your workers requiring not to be fed. I'll get to feeding your workers later on. Each player will choose 2 of these starting tiles to keep, with the other 2 being returned to the box. Each player will then gain the corn, resources, advance up the temples, and advance along the tech trees of every tile that they have left. If a starting tile allows you to move up a temple track like this one here, you will immediately then move your marker 1 space up the appropriate god's track. For future reference, this represents the brown god, this represents the sun god, and this represents the green god. You'll be able to tell which of these symbols belong to each god, as each of these gods has that symbol at the top of each of their temples. One thing to keep in mind is that if you are setting up for a game with less than 4 players, then there is 1 extra setup step, and that is to place dummy workers around the board. If you are setting up for 4 players, however, then you can skip this part. After you deal out the 4 starting tiles to each player, before they choose which 2 to keep, you will then take the remaining stack of tiles, shuffle them, and then start taking them off of the stack one at a time. Each of these shows a specific gear that is on the board along with a number. The number represents the action space that is on that gear. You will then take a worker that does not belong to one of the players and place it on the action space that matches the one listed on the tile. If this is the first worker that is placed on that gear, you will then take another worker and then place it on the opposite action spot of that worker. You will do this until all of the workers that do not belong to any of the players have been placed onto the gears. Finally, give the start player marker to the player who most recently sacrificed something. If there is a tie, the starting marker then goes to the player who volunteered for the next sacrifice. Once you have done everything that has been stated, you are ready to begin. The game takes place over the course of several rounds, consisting of either 2 or 3 phases, depending on what round you are in. The phases that are in each round in the following order are the player turns, the food phase, and then the calendar phase. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that the food phase only takes place during the game's 4 food days, which are represented by the 4 colors on the gear, so you will often skip this step. Starting with the first player and going clockwise, on your turn, you will do one of 2 things. You will either place workers onto the board, or you will take workers off the board and perform their actions. You have to choose between either placing workers or picking them up. You cannot place some workers down and then pick up others. You also cannot just simply pass on your turn. If you would like to place a worker, you simply then will take a worker that you have in your hand and you will place it on the lowest numbered action space on one of the 5 gears. It is possible to place multiple workers on your turn, and it is even possible to place all of your workers on one turn. One thing to keep in mind, however, is that placing workers is going to cost you corn. Each of the various spaces on each of the various gears has a certain amount of corn listed in their action spaces, meaning that in order to place a worker in that space, you will have to pay the amount of corn listed on that space. For example, if I were to place my worker here, I don't have to pay anything because it was a 0 in that space. But if later on my same turn, I wanted to place another worker here, well, that would mean because this is the lowest numbered space, then I have to place my worker here. Now, there is a number listed here, which is 1, so that would mean it would cost me 1 corn to place my worker in that space. In another example, let's say I wanted to place my worker on this gear. The lowest numbered action space is here, so I would place my worker here, and the cost to place that worker there is 2, so then I would pay 2 corn, and I would be able to place my worker there. You will also pay corn for the amount of workers that you have placed on your turn. For example, if I had placed 3 workers on my turn, then that would mean I would look down to where it shows 3 workers, and whatever this big number shows is how much corn I would pay to the bank in addition to the cost of placing my workers in the various spaces. In this example, I have placed 3 workers down. That would mean that for 3 workers, I would pay 3 corn. Now, I would also have to pay an extra corn because this space costs 1 corn to place my worker in that space. So, 3 workers placed, plus 1 extra for having to place my worker in this space. Remember, these starting spaces all have 0. So that would mean that I would have to pay a total of 4 corn to the bank for the 3 workers that I have placed. You don't really need to remember what this number on the side here are. These are basically meant to explain how much the cost to place the workers are increased by for the amount of workers that you've placed. For example, placing 2 workers is 1 corn, which is 1 more than placing 1 worker, which is 0. If you place 3 workers, then the cost goes up by 2 compared to placing 2 workers, and so on. There are a couple things to keep in mind when you're placing workers. You cannot place more workers than you can afford, and you cannot choose to place 0 workers. There's also 1 space between Chichen Itza and Palanku. This is where you can go to get the first player marker if it is already unoccupied. I'll talk about getting the first player marker and what everything happens with that later on. The other thing you can choose to do on your turn is to pick up your workers. If you have at least 1 worker on a gear, you can choose to pick them up instead of placing them. If you want to pick up your workers, you will simply pick which workers that you want to pick up and remove them from the gears. For each worker that you have picked up, you can choose to do one of the following. You can choose to either perform the action that was listed in that worker's space. You can use a lower numbered action by paying 1 corn for each step back on the gear that you go, or you can simply pick up your worker and do nothing with it. One thing to keep in mind is that whenever you pick up a worker, you perform the actions of those workers sequentially, but you choose what order they get performed in. This is a good time to talk about what the actions on the various gears actually do, and I'll go over each of them now, starting with Palanku. Palanku is basically meant to be where you collect food and wood. Each of these actions relate to collecting one or the other. If you were to use this action when you take your worker off of that space, you are basically going fishing. Now the game does not actually have fish tokens, so to represent you fishing, you will simply gather 3 corn and place them into your supply. Normally, each of these action spaces have a limited amount of tokens that can be collected. Fishing, however, is the exception, so any player can go here as many number of times as they want to gather 3 food without having to worry about running out. This, however, is used for harvesting corn. If you use this space, you can then take 1 of these corn tokens off of that space, and then you will then add 4 corn to your supply. Once all of the corn tokens have been removed from a certain space, that action can no longer be taken by anyone for the rest of the game. Action spaces 3, 4, and 5 are similar to action space 2, however, these all start the game covered with wood tokens. What this means is that before the corn can be harvested from each of these locations, the wood tokens have to be removed first. If you were to take an action on these 3 spaces, you can choose to either simply take the wood token and add the appropriate amount of wood to your supply listed on that space. When you do this, like I said, you will take the wood token off of that space, and that will reveal a corn token that can then be harvested later on. Corn tokens, like I said, cannot be harvested until the wood tokens on top of them have been removed. There is an alternative way that you can remove the wood tokens and simply just take the corn underneath it, and that is by burning the forest. To burn the forest, simply take the wood token off of one of the spaces and remove it from the game. You can then immediately take that corn token and whatever food is on that space into your supply. However, by doing this, you are going to be angering the gods. And I'll talk about angering the gods and what you do when you anger them later on. If you take an action on a space that is showing a corn token and wood tokens, then you have a choice of either collecting the wood token and the wood shown in that space. For example, in space 4, it would be 3 wood along with the wood token, or you can simply leave that token and take the corn token instead and collect the amount of corn listed on that space. For example, this space would get 7 corn, with this token. The last two spaces on Palanku are free action spaces. By using this action, you can perform these previous actions on the gear without having to pay a coin for each action that you go back. Remember, in order to perform a previous action, you would have to pay 1 coin for each space backwards that you go. Here's an example of how taking an action on Palanku would go. I have this worker here. I would pick up this worker, and then I would pick up this token because the only tokens that are available are wood tokens. I would then collect 3 wood from the general supply and place it in my personal supply. This corn token can now be harvested in a later turn. Yaxchilan is basically where you will go to gain resources. Taking an action in the first space will then allow you to gain a single wood. Taking an action on space 2 lets you gain a stone and a corn. Taking an action on space 3 will let you get a gold and 2 corn. Space 4 lets you gain a crystal skull. Space 5 gets you a stone, a gold, and 2 corn. And spaces 6 and 7 will allow you to take any previous step on that gear without having to pay to do it. One thing to keep in mind, however, is that the crystal skulls are limited to the 13 skulls that are on the supply. Once the 13th skull has been taken for any reason, crystal skulls can no longer be collected, meaning that the 4th action space has no effect, as crystal skulls do not get returned to the general supply. Tikal is where you can build buildings and increase your technology. Space 1 of Tikal will allow you to increase one of your markers on one of the 4 technology tracks. There are 4 technology tracks in the game, and they are each related to one of the 5 gears. You'll be able to tell which one is related to the 5 gears based on the colors that are showing on these tracks. Each of these technologies will give you a benefit when you perform a certain action on a certain gear. This space allows you to collect 1 extra corn whenever you harvest corn from Palanku. Harvesting corn does not include fishing. This space allows you to ignore the limits of the corn tokens on the Palanku action spaces and allows you to gain an extra corn when you are fishing. For example, if I had that technology and I took my worker off of this space, even though there are no more corn tokens on this space, I could still take this action and get the 4 corn as normal. I just wouldn't collect the corn token. This one allows you to collect 2 extra corn whenever you harvest corn. This one allows you to collect an extra wood whenever you gain a wood, either from Palanku or Yaxchilan. You can tell this because it has both the gray and green color, which is the gears that they associate with. This one allows you to collect an extra stone whenever Yaxchilan gives you a stone. This allows you to collect an extra gold whenever you collect gold. And this one allows you to collect an extra crystal skull whenever you collect a crystal skull, again on the appropriate gear. This one means whenever you perform a building action on Tikal or Uxmal, which is the brown and yellow gear, you will gain a food. This means if you construct a building on one of the 2 gears, you will gain 2 points, and this allows you to build a building for 1 less resource of your choice. I'll get to constructing buildings in a moment. These 2 spaces down here are related to the Chichen Itza gear, which is the blue gear, which I'll talk about in a few moments. To advance on one of these technologies, you need to pay a certain amount of resources depending on which technology you are advancing to. For example, if I wanted to advance from this space to this space, I would have to pay 1 resource of my choice. To advance from this space to this space, I would pay 2 resources, and from here to here, I would pay 3. This final space, however, is very special because once your marker gets to the 3rd space of that track, you cannot advance on that track any further. If you were to take an action that would allow you to advance on that track, you simply gain the bonus listed on the edge of the track instead. If you were to advance to get this bonus, you simply will just pay 1 resource. This space allows you to move up 1 step of one of the 3 temples of your choice. This spot gets you 2 resources of your choice. This one will give you 3 points, and this one gives you a crystal skull. It is possible to gain the bonuses of the final space multiple times. For example, if you are given an opportunity to advance on a track twice, you can simply then move this track twice and gain this bonus twice, paying the resources that you need to do so. Going back to the Tikal gear, this space, space 3, allows you to move up either 2 technology tracks once or 1 technology track twice, paying the resources required to do so. Space 2 allows you to construct a building. Space 4 on Tikal will allow you to either construct 1 building, construct 2 buildings, or build a monument, paying the appropriate cost to do so. There are several different buildings and monuments in the game, each of which has 2 things you need to know. They have a cost in the top of the building, represented by resources, either in wood, stone, or gold, and they will have a benefit that will happen once you construct them. To construct a building, simply take the resources that you need to build the building that you want, put them back into the general supply, and then take the building that you wanted to build and place that building in front of you. Whenever you build a normal building, you immediately gain the effect listed on that building. For example, this building allows me to immediately gain a gold, and it allows me to move up 1 space on this technology track for free. Whenever you build a building, you then must replace that building at the end of your turn. The new building that comes out must be from your current age. For example, if you built this in age 1, you can only replace it with an age 1 building. If, however, all of the buildings from that age have already been built, then that space will remain empty. Monuments, however, are different than normal buildings. These are basically ways to score extra points at the end of the game. If you ever construct a monument, the space that the monument was in is left empty. If all of the monuments have been constructed, then no more monuments can be built for the rest of the game. If you choose to construct 2 buildings, then you can apply any of the architecture technologies that you have uncovered to either the first or second building. But one of them must be built without the use of technology. Technologies can never be used on monuments. There are a couple things to note, however, when constructing 2 buildings. If the first building that you've built allows you to get a new technology on this track, then you can apply that effect and any others to the second building as long as you did not apply any architect effects to the first one. If you did, however, then you cannot apply it to the second one. If the first building you built gives you a resource, you are allowed to spend that resource that you just got to construct the second building. If the first building you built allows you to perform an action, like this one, perform that action before you build the second building. To save us some time, I'm not going to talk about what every single building and monument in the game does, but I am going to put a graphic up here, and that's basically going to explain every single effect that you will encounter on the buildings, the monuments, and the starting wealth tiles. If you ever need to check what an effect on a building or a monument does, or even one of the action spaces do, then the game actually has on the back of the rulebook a chart that describes each of the actions that are on the wealth tiles, the buildings, and the monuments, as well as the effects that you will encounter on the various action spaces. Space 5 of Tikal will allow you to spend 1 resource to move up 2 different temples 1 step. This means that you can spend 1 resource to move up 2 different temples by one step of your choice. Remember, it has to be different temples. You cannot spend a resource to move up a temple twice. I'll talk more about the temples and what all they do in a little bit. Finally, the final two spaces of Tikal will allow you to take any of the previous actions on the Tikal gear without having to spend extra corn to do so. Uxmal, the yellow gear, is basically a way to trade for things. Space 1 on Uxmal will let you trade 3 corn to move up one of the temples by one step. One thing to keep in mind though is that you can only do that once per action. Meaning, for example, you couldn't take your worker off of this space and spend 9 corn to move up a temple 3 times. Space 2 allows you to exchange resources for corn and or corn for resources as many times as you want. The exchange rate for resources to corn is listed right next to the technology track. Space 3 allows you to collect a new worker from the bank and place it in front of you. You cannot take this action, however, if you have all 6 workers. Space 4 allows you to construct a building using corn. When you do this, you will pay 2 corn for each resource that you are using to construct the building, and you can only construct the building using corn. You cannot use any portion of the cost with resources. You also cannot use this action to construct a monument. Space 5 allows you to pay 1 corn to perform any action that is on any of the gears except for Chichen Itza, which is the blue gear. Finally, spaces 6 and 7 will allow you to perform 1 action anywhere on Uxmal's gear. However, if you choose action 5, you do still need to pay that 1 corn to perform that action. Then there's Chichen Itza, which is the blue gear. This is where you will place the crystal skulls that you have collected in order to earn points and earn favor from the gods. Anytime you perform an action on Chichen Itza, you will then place a crystal skull into the space where you took your worker off to let everybody know that this space can no longer be used for the rest of the game. You will then gain all of the benefits listed on that space. Each of these spaces allow you to earn points and move up on the various temples. These 3 spaces will give you points and allow you to move up 1 space on the brown temple. These 3 give you points and let you move up 1 step on the green temple. And these 3 allow you to gain points and move up 1 step on the yellow temple. Some of the spaces in Chichen Itza also have this resource symbol on it. What that means is that whenever you place a crystal skull in that space, in addition to the points and allowing you to move up that temple's track 1 step, you are also allowed to gain 1 resource of your choice. Finally, the final space allows you to take any action on Chichen Itza's gear, paying the crystal skull to do so. Now that we've talked about the actions on Chichen Itza, we can talk about the 2 technologies that relate to it. The first one means that whenever you perform an action on Chichen Itza, you can instead choose to perform the action that is ahead of the spot that you pulled your worker off. For example, if I had that technology and I pulled my worker off here, I could, instead of placing a skull here, I could choose to place it here, since it's the next spot along the gear. The last one means that after you perform an action on Chichen Itza, you may immediately spend 1 resource to move up 1 step on the temple of your choice. If you had gained a resource block from your Chichen Itza action, it is available for you to spend in this way. After all the players have taken a turn, whether they have placed workers or taken them off, the round is done, and the main calendar gear, which is this big one in the middle, is advanced by 1 day counterclockwise. You will notice that all of the workers have now advanced 1 space. This is how you move your workers around to get them to the actions that you want them to perform. Any workers that are on the highest spots of the gears, whenever the calendar gear is rotated again, will be pushed off of the gear, returned to their owners, and their owners will not get any actions with the workers that have been pulled off. One thing to know, however, is that if you are playing a game with dummy workers, then the dummy workers never get taken off. This will mean that sometimes they will end up blocking an action space that does not have a number. If after rotating the calendar, nobody had gone to the starting player's space, you will then take a corn token and place it on the current tooth that is next to the arrow. However, if after rotating the calendar, somebody had taken the first player's space, then the rules for advancing the calendar will be different, which I will get into now. In any round where nobody chose to go to the first player's space, corn will be placed on the teeth in the central gear. Whenever you place a worker on the first player's space, you will take all that corn as soon as your turn is done, meaning you cannot use this corn to pay for placing workers this round. There are two other effects that happen whenever you place your worker in the starting player's space. First, you do not have to wait and do a pickup round to take your worker back. You can take this worker back automatically at the end of the round if you place it here, similar to when a worker gets pushed off of a gear. These are the only two ways to get a worker back without having to pick it up. Second, the starting player marker will change hands. It will always change hands if you choose this action. Obviously, if you were to go here and you don't have the first player marker, you will then get it at the end of the round. However, if you placed your worker there and you already had the first player marker, then the first player marker will then be passed to the player on your left. One thing to note is that going here is the only way to get the first player marker to change hands. If after a round nobody had gone here, then the first player marker will stay with the player who had previously had it. The final benefit of going to the first player space is that you can advance the calendar. Normally at the end of a round, the calendar will only advance by one tooth. However, if somebody had gone to the first player's space before the end of the round, that player can decide if they want to advance the calendar by a second tooth. There is, however, 3 limitations when it comes to advancing the calendar by 2 days. First, you cannot advance the calendar by 2 days if you had already done it. Each player is allowed to advance the calendar by 2 days once per game. Once you advance the calendar, you will take your player board and you will flip it over so that it shows this symbol to remind you that you cannot advance it by 2 days again. There is a way, however, to get your board back to the lighter side, which I will get to later. You also cannot advance the calendar by 2 days to cause a worker to be pushed off of a gear where it would normally not be pushed off. Even if you can't use the time speeding privilege that you can get when you go to the first player space, you do still get all the other benefits of going there. The last thing you cannot do when it comes to advancing the calendar by 2 days is by advancing the calendar by 2 days in order to skip a food day. Food days are marked by either having an orange resource symbol up here or a green victory point symbol up here. I'll get to what each of those mean a little bit later. If the next day that would happen would be a food day, you are still allowed to advance the calendar by 2 days. However, the new round will be the food day that was skipped over. Another thing to note is that if this is the final round of the game, then speeding the gear up and moving the first player marker will not give you any advantages. But you can use the starting player space to collect the accumulated corn on the calendar gear. Now let's talk about the temples. There are 3 temples in the game, each one dedicated to a different god. There are many ways that you can move up the various temples that I've already talked about. Choosing a starting tile that allows you to immediately move 1 up, leaving a crystal skull on Chichen Itza, paying 3 corn on the first space of Uxmal, paying 1 resource on the 5th space of Tikal, constructing a building that gives you the privilege, or applying a technology that gives you the privilege. If you were to receive a privilege that allows you to move up a temple, but you can't go any higher, then that privilege is wasted. Whenever you reach the top of the temple, then you are allowed to immediately take your board and flip it back over to its lighter side if it is on its darker side, allowing you to advance the calendar by 2 days again. However, if you reach the top of a temple and your board is already on its lighter side, then that privilege is wasted. On each of these temples, the top space can only be occupied by a single player. Once player has reached the top of a temple, no other player can get there unless the player who's already up there moves down. The only way that you are able to move down on a temple is if you were to anger the gods. There are 2 ways to anger the gods. Either by burning a forest, like I had already mentioned, where you simply take the wood token and simply remove it from the game, and then take the corn token. If you do burn a forest, then you have to move one of your markers of your choice down 1 step on the temple. If you're already on the bottom step of all 3 temples, then you are not allowed to burn the forest. Another way you can anger the gods is by begging for corn. At the beginning of your turn, if you have 2 or fewer corn left in your supply, then you can choose to beg for corn by discarding all of the corn that you have and then drawing exactly 3 corn from the bank. Once again, if you do this, you must choose one of the temples and move your marker down 1 step. Just like when burning the forest, if you find that you're on the bottom step of all 3 temples, then you cannot beg for corn. There is a rare case where you will find that you will have none of your workers on a gear, but you don't have enough corn to place a worker, so that you would have to beg for corn. If you are forced to beg for corn to place a worker out, but you're already on the bottom step of the 3 temples, in this situation, the gods will take pity on you and allow you to place exactly 1 worker. You will then place your worker on an action space with the lowest possible cost and then give all of the corn that you have to the bank. Now that we've talked about everything that can happen in a normal round, we need to talk about the second phase that can happen in 4 rounds of the game, which is the food phase. There are 4 food days in the game. Each of them are marked by one of these 2 symbols. A food day is played like a normal round. However, after everybody has taken a turn, before the calendar advances, the players must pay food and feed their workers before the calendar advances. To feed your workers, you must pay 2 corn to the bank for each worker that you have in play. Workers are considered in play whenever they are on a gear or sitting in front of you. You must feed as many of the workers as you can. If you fail to feed them all, you lose 3 points for each worker that you cannot feed. You also cannot feed half a worker. For example, if I had 3 workers, but I only had 5 corn, I would feed 2 workers, meaning I would discard my 5 and get 1 back from the bank, and then I would lose 3 points because I couldn't feed my last worker. It is possible for points to go negative. After each player feeds their workers, you will then be awarded by the gods depending on what point of the age you are in. As I said, there are 2 types of symbols in the game, and these basically determine what point in the age you are in. The one with the resource symbol surrounded by a brown little tooth represents the middle of an age. The victory point symbol, surrounded by the bluish-green background, signifies the end of an age. If you are in the middle of an age, you will be rewarded with resources from the gods depending on where you are in the temples. The items that you receive from the temple depend on where you are in the temple. You will receive all resources or crystal skulls for the level that you are currently at in the temple, as well as any temple spaces that you are above. For example, this green player is on this level of the green temple, so that means he will get a wood. He's also above this spot of the temple, which also has a wood on it, so he will be given a second wood from the green temple. The green player also is equal to this spot which has gold on it on the yellow temple, so he will also receive 1 gold. However, he is below this spot on the yellow temple, so he will not receive that one. The same thing goes for green and this spot in the brown temple. He is equal to this spot in the brown temple, so he will receive 1 stone, but he is below this spot in the brown temple, so he will not receive the 2nd stone. One thing to note is that if the bank does not have enough crystal skulls to award a crystal skull to every player that should get one, then nobody gets a crystal skull. The food days with the blue-green background, like I said earlier, signify the end of an age. This will happen at the middle and at the end of the game. Similar to the middle of an age, you will be rewarded by the gods for your temples. However, instead of resources, you will be awarded points based on where you're currently marked in the temple only. For example, green is here, so that means he will be awarded 5 points. Blue is here, so they will be awarded 1 point. Another thing to note is that whenever you are scoring points on the temple, the highest player on each of the temples will also receive bonus points depending on what age you are in. The lower left number indicates the bonus at the end of the first age. The higher number is the bonus at the end of the second age. If multiple players are tied for the highest spot on a temple at the end of an age, then the tied players receive half the bonus. The buildings, however, change at the end of age 1. At the end of age 1, after the temple points have been scored, all of the remaining age 1 buildings are removed from the board. They, along with any remaining in the age 1 stack, will be placed back in the box as they will no longer be used. Instead, you will deal out 6 age 2 buildings onto the board, and from now on, those are the buildings that will be used. One thing to note though is that monuments are not affected by the end of an age, nor are buildings that have already been built. Another thing to note, anytime a player gains points, immediately move their score marker that many spaces up the score track. After the 4th food day has ended, the game is over, as the calendar will have completed 1 full rotation. Whenever the game ends, you will perform the following 4 steps to determine your final score. You will turn all leftover resources that you have into corn using the same exchange rate that I showed earlier. Then you will convert your corn into points. Every 4 corn that you have is worth 1 point. Any extra crystal skulls that you have are worth 3 points, and you will score extra points depending on the conditions of the monuments that you have built. Whoever has the most points is the winner. In the case of a tie, whoever has the most workers left on the gears win. If there's still a tie, then the tied players shared the win. One final note is that the calendar gear advances 1 more day after the end of age 2 scoring, but before the final scoring. This can push workers off of the gears, which could affect tiebreakers. And that's everything you need to know in order to play Tzolk'in, the Mayan calendar. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. I hope you all enjoyed this video. If you did, give it a big thumbs up. If you want to learn my thoughts on Tzolk'in, the Mayan calendar, or if you just want more videos, make sure you subscribe to the channel for more tutorials, reviews, and unboxings. Thank you all as always so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.